Hello and welcome to Wright Media. I'm Ruben Wright. Yesterday I read an interesting article about Johnson and Johnson. Currently we know that they're in process of a COVID-19 vaccine as they try to get it ready for distribution, going through governmental channels, going through various processes. But the one thing that kind of came to my memory with Johnson and Johnson is their amazing PR case that they had back in the 1980s. 1982 to be frank. Back in 1982, Johnson and Johnson was tasked with arguably one of the worst PR crises that we've seen in human history. What happened to Johnson and Johnson was, at the time, like they still do, they produced Tylenol. Well, back in 1982, they had, their famous drug Tylenol. They were shipping it across the country. People were taking it, people used it, it worked. Well, in 1982, in Chicago, there was an incident with their Tylenol capsules. What happened was their Tylenol capsules got laced with cyanide, and in result, 7 people died in the Chicago metropolitan area. So what really happened with this situation was Johnson & Johnson, by really no fault of their own at the time, was now in possession of a product that had just killed 7 people. All 7 of those victims had taken Tylenol. The police did an investigation. It all linked back to the fact that someone had laced Tylenol with cyanide. And these individuals had then taken these Tylenol capsules, and what in result happened was they died. So Johnson & Johnson was faced with a situation where they had to figure out, what are we going to do? We are now indirectly responsible for the deaths of 7 people. Our product being laced has caused these deaths. So their PR team, their company, had to figure out what's next to do. So Johnson & Johnson is always labeled, and this case is always labeled, as one of the greatest things that a PR team, a company can follow, because how they handled it and how Johnson & Johnson went from their lowest point to now still being a very big company in the pharmaceutical industry. So what Johnson & Johnson did was they decided the basic principles of what you should as a PR person or a PR practitioner, someone who is involved in a company's PR, is they were honest. They told, the public what had happened. They told the public the truth, all the facts, how they were connected to it. And yes, at the time, that was a massive risk. That risk led their share price to drop dramatically from about 35% to then about 8% of the actual overall market. So they took a big hit nonetheless. But this was a hit that they knew they had to take if they wanted to look for the company's long-term future. So what Johnson & Johnson essentially risked was monetary losses at the moment for monetary gains in a future in the present. So Johnson & Johnson came up with this strategy to kind of recall all of their products, issue apologies, kind of tell the public, the media, the real facts of what had happened with the situation. And in turn, they also went back to research and development. They developed a new type of capsule, the holding container for their Tylenol pills. They developed this triple sealed container that was pretty much, in theory, for the actual consumer, infallible. Now it wasn't a situation where you just bought your over-the-counter Tylenol pills. You would just take them, blah blah blah. Instead, now they'd be sealed, fully tampered-proof, in a sense that someone could still tamper with them. But when they got to the consumer, a situation, if they had all these seals, you then had a situation where no one would be able to just walk into a store like they would be able to back in 1982. Lace the capsule. Put it back together, it's on the shelf, someone then buys that capsule. No, now you had all these steps that someone would have to follow. If one of those seals is broken, you get rid of the capsule, you don't take any of the pills because you don't know what's happened to them. But that was their decision, was to go back into development and find and kind of recraft these capsules. So what's so amazing about this story is that the worst thing that could happen to any company, especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals, is death. Your product is the result of someone's death. And Johnson & Johnson, that is exactly what happened. 7 people die because of your product. Yes, not completely their fault, but in a way they do, have to take some responsibility. Exactly what they did. They took responsibility for the actions, and they found a way to fix it and make sure this could never happen again. As a PR team, and as Johnson and Johnson, they risked the idea of that. Like I said, the idea that in the present, monetarily, they're going to take a hit. They took the hit. But now if we look at Johnson & Johnson, I opened it up talking about how I read a story about them and a COVID-19 vaccine. Johnson & Johnson is still a major player in the pharmaceutical industry. And really it goes back to this decision for their company as a whole, their PR team as a whole, to navigate these waters. You have to be honest with your consumer base. You have to give everyone the facts. You can't really hide things, because in a situation with Johnson & Johnson, they had to address this. They had to, of course, take responsibility for the actions that, had happened. But then they could have, simply issued the apology, done a little, charity, done a little handouts, blah, blah, blah. They don't go into the research and development stage. They don't go into these extra, practices that they take. And all of a sudden, your company's under. Because really, this case also was a revolutionary thing for the pharmaceutical industry with these packaging. Now today, you buy a package of pills, you buy over-the-counter things, completely sealed. Even not over-the-counter. They're all sealed, tamper-proof. It's also, kind of moved on to other areas of consumer products with tamper-proof things. So, as a PR team, what is important if you face a crisis like this? Well, like I said, you have to be honest. You have to be transparent. If you're not honest, you're not transparent with this information, especially with it being so critical, as well as just probably some of the most, emotional, a case that everyone around the country is following. Headlines. For a journalist, this is a headline that easy to write. 7 people dead as a result of Tylenol. Boom. That's a front page headliner. And Johnson & Johnson found a way to combat that with giving honesty, giving transparency. And I think the interesting thing that you can really take away from this case is that where we've seen many other companies falter, have a situation where they're, backing off. The statement, of course, doesn't seem to tell the whole truth. The statement seems to be more just, communication, what some people call PR speak. But the situation is, I think Johnson & Johnson gives not only people, but also people who are interested in PR, interested in communication, a great example to see that when you're truthful, when you're honest, it does lead to a situation where you can preserve your company down the road. If Johnson & Johnson takes a different approach, we might be sitting here and there might not be a company called Johnson & Johnson anymore. But because of the result of them being able to handle a crisis, and one of the biggest crises, but also this kind of shows why the idea of always being prepared for anything, always have a plan in place, always have a crisis plan in place, a situation where if you have that plan, you're ready to deal with anything. You have a step, a chain of command, you have those essentially not full crafted out messages, but the idea of, what are we going to say? If something bad happens to us, who needs to talk? When do we need to talk? Who do we need to contact? Blah, blah, blah. And essentially that's what Johnson & Johnson had, as well as that's what they did. And when we look back on this case and why people think of it as probably the greatest example of a crisis communication situation, is because they didn't fail. They were successful, and today they're still a successful company. We've seen a lot of situations recently. I think one we can talk on really quickly is look at the difference between the Johnson & Johnson case in 1982 to where they are now, and let's take a more recent. Last week, we had a situation with the investing app called Robinhood. So with Robinhood, the interesting thing to look at is kind of what happened with the PR situation that occurred with their idea that last week they were going to limit the amount of shares you could buy of these stocks that were tied to a Reddit forum called Wall Street Bets that was then going up against a large hedge fund in the investing world. So the interesting thing when you look at Robinhood and their CEO is that they release these statements talking about they're for their investors, they're for the people, blah, blah, blah. They've had a mission statement. There's multiple tweets from back in 2016 of situations where they're talking about we want everyone to trade. We're for the people. Their mission statement pretty much says that they want to be the app that the average anybody can invest, bringing new people to the stock market that that never dreamed that they could get there to be able to invest. And the situation is, last week Robinhood kind of went against their own mission statement as well as their own principles, instead siding with the large hedge funds that came out to finally see that they were invested in by and gained capital from some of these big Wall Street hedge funds. So the interesting thing is that how you handle situations like this. With Johnson and Johnson, we saw a situation where they handled it well. They handled a crises well, a crisis that is probably worse than what Robinhood had to do, where they had to handle with people dying as a result of their product. Robinhood had a situation where average day people were becoming successful by using their app when fighting against someone that has a stake in your company. So as a PR team, you have a situation where, and a company, their CEO in that too, but as a PR team, what you have to consult your CEO on is a situation where do we, one, go with the people who are invested in us, the hedge funds, blah, 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 who give us capital, or two, do we stick to our values, mission statement, blah, blah, blah. Now this is a crisis that you could say they probably wouldn't have seen coming, but it's a lot more predictable than I think the case with Johnson and Johnson. And the point I'm trying to make here is that, like Johnson and Johnson, like many other companies, you got to be prepared for any situation. Robinhood was definitely not prepared for this situation to happen, and as a result, they're slowly gaining back some of the love, but they went from hero, a week and a half to go, to the next day, a villain. Multiple people came out calling them out. The Mark Cubans of the world, the billionaires. The only people that were on their side in the end were the hedge funds. The people that they were supposed to be fighting against. Their mission says so. And that's the thing. If they were prepared more for this crisis, they looked and prepared, had plans in place, thought about this, a situation that could be likely to happen, that something pits you against, the people you give your product to versus the people that invest in your product, especially in the world of investing, that's something that could happen. So it's a situation that the moral of the story is you have to be prepared. Johnson & Johnson, prepared. As a result, hugely successful pharmaceutical company today, even after having one of the worst crises in the history of not even pharmaceutical, but probably business. Robinhood, we'll see where they go. We'll see what happens. Does the actions they took, the statements they gave out, the kind of weaving in and out of what they used to consider their mission statement, saying no, it's for the people, we're doing this, we're limiting you because we want to protect you, kind of at this point a term I don't like, many PR people don't like, but using the idea of PR speak. At that time, they most definitely were weaving through and trying to figure out how they could keep the love of everyone they serve as a product for investing, but at the same time keep the love of the people invested in their app, being the hedge funds, the billionaires, things like that. It'll be an interesting story to look at, and I think we could see in 1-2 months, has their user base dropped? Have they had less people liking their app? Has their app lost the support that it once had? It'll be an interesting story to talk about, and maybe one that we'll have in a couple weeks, couple months, maybe a year from now. But thank you for listening. to this story, kind of about Johnson and Johnson. I thought it'd be an interesting story to talk about, especially with that, reading an article about them and a COVID-19 vaccine. They're an interesting case. They're a case that I think every company has to look at, every person who's just interested in PR has to look at, because they really represent the model of crisis communications and the model of, if a crisis happens, what should you be prepared for? What should you do? Especially when you're looking for something like your company to last and go farther and farther into the future, as we've seen with Johnson and Johnson. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you check back later. I hope you like and subscribe for some more great content around things like this, companies, investing, stocks. Maybe we'll go into some other things, video games, sports, maybe one day. But I really hope you enjoyed this video. I really hope to see you next time.